We're back now with part B of the Unit 4, where we are dealing with Plato's philosophy, and we've moved from metaphysics in the first section of the video for Plato. Now we're coming to deal with epistemology. And as we come to deal with epistemology, again let me remind you of the class worksheet. Hopefully you're following through. Previously we're going down the left-hand column through the pages. Now we're coming to epistemology, the centre column. And you'll find there are a number of questions here which relate to the presentation here in the video and in the PowerPoint notes. And you should be able to fill out the answers to the worksheet. That will help you follow along. Again, you know about the textbook and referred you to that. We've seen this slide before concerning the overall necessary things for us to note as we make our way through Plato's metaphysics, epistemology and value theory. Now, when we come to his epistemology, we're going to be looking at innate ideas, and this is his justification for his assertion that the forms exist. It's going to be his justification for their essential role in the process of understanding reality, metaphysics, and being able to have wisdom and understanding and distinguishing that from the knowledge we gain from experience, like perception. And we're going to look at the allegory of the cave and then try to look at the various levels of epistemology. There are 4 of them, and we'll talk about those. So you can see the other items we'll cover on the way. Help us on this process. We're going to go back to these big questions. Leave behind the metaphysical questions, now to the epistemological ones. There are 2 primary ones. How to know the truth for certain, and how can all mankind know the same truth? And with those 2 big questions in mind, we need to pause for a moment and have a preliminary discussion about what is the truth. If we're looking for the truth, we should know, in a sense, what the truth actually looks like. Now, for many of the philosophers of the classic era, the time of Socrates, Plato and Aristotle and the pre-Socratics, they held a view which can be known as foundationalism. It established a criteria for knowing what the truth was. And while this is not the only definition of foundationalism you'll come across, the one I've given you in red on the screen is really applicable to Plato and Aristotle and will, I think, help you come to terms with what they are doing. There are other definitions of foundationalism that pick up the idea that foundationalism is the idea that the ideas we have in our mind correspond to the objects that exist in the world outside the mind. In a sense, that's another definition, but that really is a discussion for a later era and a later topic. But for our purposes, foundationalism is an assertion that for something to be true, it must be meaningfully connected to something that is real and unchangeable. And of course, those somethings that were real and unchangeable were, of course, the forms. And that brings us to the whole question of the nature and the character of innate ideas. Now, Plato wants to use a discussion of innate ideas to establish the validity of the existence of the forms. And he's got to show, how do we know the forms exist? And then secondly, of course, how do everyone in the world know about these forms? How do we share this knowledge? Now, before we go on to look at his arguments and to try and make sense of his conclusions, we need to remind ourselves there is a huge difference between the way the classic philosophers want to think about the world and evaluate and justify what they think. And that difference is the difference between what we would call today the scientific method, the empirical scientific method. And that's what we would do. We would set up a thesis, plan a series of experimentations, evaluate after those experiments whether the thesis was validated or invalidated. And we'll take care to see that we had reasonable justification for the conclusions we came to. However, there's quite a big difference, because the classic philosophers were not doing that. They were using reason. This was their new tool of inquiry. And they looked at the world around them, and then they reasoned or reflected upon what they saw. And from those reflections, they speculated as to what might be. Sometimes it's called speculative reasoning. I don't throw speculative reasoning out as a poor form of reasoning. Many of the great insights of history and of science and of mathematics had their beginnings with this kind of reasoning. And with that background in mind, that we need to let these philosophers reason their way through the problems, let's pause and remind ourselves of the summary diagram we gave you when we were talking about metaphysics. You will see this is the same diagram, and just like the worksheet, it has the three columns: metaphysics on the left, epistemology in the centre, and value theory on the right. And you will notice that the three columns are divided in half by the red line called the dividing line. Now, when we were looking at metaphysics, you realised that the left-hand quadrant under metaphysics was the world of forms, in which there were two levels. There were the higher conceptual forms, and then there were the scientific and math forms. The higher forms, you see here, and the lower forms here. This is the world of being, the world of the forms, the world of non-change. This, below the dividing line in metaphysics, was the world of change, the world of becoming. In that world there were objects and shadows and images. And those levels of reality are real, but there's a sense in which they are not as real as the world up here. This world doesn't change, this one does. Plato was addressing change and non-change and how you identify the one and the many. And he was using this as a tool. When we come to epistemology, there is not only a vertical relationship, but a horizontal one. With the higher forms, we use them to know what justice and beauty and wisdom are. They're categories. And with the lower forms, the scientific forms, we use those to assemble data. Now, in our minds today, we would assemble data and speculate and work through what we thought was wisdom. But in Plato's mind, the data was used to enable us to understand the reality of what wisdom really was. It wasn't something we worked out, it was something was there, and we reflected upon it, and we really deep down inside knew what it was. Below the dividing line in epistemology, we have opinion and perception. Plato recognises that we do learn things by experience. We do perceive and see things. But when we do so, unlike the knowledge which is obtained above the dividing line, which is objective and certain, knowledge below the dividing line is merely perception. It's opinion. And when our perceptive knowledge is based upon shadows and imagery, we have to use our imagination to try and work out what in the world it is. And so it's imagination, a different idea of the world imagination. So these are the four levels of wisdom: knowledge, opinion, and imagination. Four levels of knowledge. And they correspond to the four levels of reality: the higher forms, the lower forms, objects, and shadows. And you'll probably have perceived from this that this continues over into the value theory system as well. So with that in mind, now let's move on to trying to understand how it is that Socrates and Plato are going to justify the existence of these forms and the fact that we have innate knowledge of them. And one of the places where Plato develops this argument is he picks up the discussion between Meno and Socrates. While they're discussing virtue, we're going to see that in that context he's going to explain and give evidence for, rational evidence for the existence of forms pre-existing in our minds. Now, we need to pause for a moment here. In our introductory videos to you, I said to you we're going to be learning new and different ideas, and you're perhaps going to be challenged. And I want to remind you that our task, particularly as philosophers, is to seek to understand, to learn, to evaluate, and not simply to cast off because we disagree with it. We need to see if we can find useful truth, useful insights in the discussions. And even if we reach the conclusion that we want to reject totally everything that another philosopher says, in this case Plato, then we need to at least have understood what they're actually saying and not simply throw it out because it jars our present conception of the world. So let's go back now to this question. How will Plato justify the existence of innate ideas? And to do that, he's going to take us to Socrates' discussion with Meno. And the little slave boy is brought into the midst of that discussion is going to be used by Socrates to give an illustration of the fact that we have innate ideas. In the Meno, Socrates brings a young slave boy and stands him before himself and Meno and proceeds to ask him a series of questions, the purpose of which is to ensure that he can show Meno that the slave boy, while not knowing mathematics, having no education and no training in it, is able to recognize when a mathematical problem is correct or incorrect by giving simple directions, because the boy has got innately the concepts that enable him to decide if what's before him is in fact mathematically correct or incorrect. Let's go over the argument as best we can. First, Socrates says to the young slave boy, here is a square, and he draws the square. And he then proceeds to draw the square, to cut the square in half, horizontally and vertically. And then points out to the boy something he needs to observe. He needs to observe this shape and this one, and this one, and this one, asking him, noting the number of squares that are there inside the square. Then he poses the problem to the young boy. How can you draw now for me a square which is twice the size of this square, has twice as many internal squares as this one does? He then suggests to the boy that he extend the sides by doubling them. So he doubles both the sides and then joins up the square. And then asks the question, is this large square twice the size of that square? Does this large square have twice as many squares as this one? And the answer is no. He can see clearly that there are, in fact, 16 squares. So he knows that that answer is wrong. So in a sense, Socrates takes him back to the next suggestion. Well, how about drawing a square which is 1.5 times the sides of this square? The sides are 1.5 times that distance there is 1.5 times that distance there. Will that create a square which is twice the size of this square? And so, how many boxes are there now? We see that there are in fact 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 not 8. So clearly that answer's wrong. Then Socrates makes a suggestion to the boy. Well, draw a diagonal across that and see if you can now draw a square which is twice the size. Now, it's easy for Socrates to ask him, is that shape half the size of that one? And clearly it is. And then he invites him to extend this side to create a new box and ask the question, is this box twice the size of that one? Well, again, the answer is yes, it is. For this triangle plus this triangle are clearly equal to the size of that original box. Ergo, this box is twice the size of the original box. Of course, it's important to point out that Socrates only wants the boy to be able to recognize the correct and incorrect answers, not to be able to explain why they are, but showing that by simply posing questions he can bring the boy to understand which box is actually twice the size. So that brings us to a question. This may perhaps bewilder us a little bit, but is there something in our experience that might help us make sense of this idea of innate ideas? Does space perception somehow show us that we aim to have some innate sense of space and shape and relationship, which is at the heart of his argument for innate ideas? So let's see if we can take a current piece of academic research. Now, the research you're going to look at is not without its controversies, not without those who would dispute it, but it's certainly illustrative, and from our perspective helps us simply understand what Socrates is arguing for and what Plato is affirming.
In this study, babies between 9 and 12 months are brought into the lab and placed on a large plexiglass top table. Half of the table has a checkerboard pattern just underneath the surface, but halfway across is a visual cliff, which the baby can tell drops off steeply. The plexiglass top continues, so it's perfectly fine to proceed. But the baby isn't so sure, and this is a big drop for a baby just starting to crawl. She wants to get across to get the toy, but she's cautious and looks to the opposite table where her mother is.
Now let's bring things together and draw out a couple of conclusions on epistemology. The first concerns the 4 levels of epistemological knowledge. We've actually been referring to them, but just to focus on them, we use the slide that you see. You'll see that we have a parallel between the 4 levels of reality, the higher forms, the lower forms, objects and shadows. You again see this in the composite diagram we have over the side. What's important for us to understand, there are 4 levels of knowledge. There is a conceptual level, there is the data level, there is the opinion level, and there's the imagination level. And these represent certainty, concepts and data. These represent opinion. These are the 4 levels. And similarly, we need to remind ourselves of the allegory of the cave. As we saw in metaphysics, the sun represented the good and the shadows represented the objects or images in the world of human experience. The epistemological application of the allegory of the cave, the sun represents wisdom and the truth, and the shadows represent opinion and knowledge. Now there's one last item I'll briefly cover, and that is this question of reincarnation and its impact upon the concept of what we know at birth. Now Plato does not expressly talk about reincarnation as such, Though the concept of reincarnation, the idea of it, clearly is part of the mythological background in the ancient world. For example, Aeneas has a wonderful story of moving from the underworld to the real world and to the world of the gods, the concept that you can move from the underworld to this world and back again. And indeed, Plato alludes to the concept of reincarnation, and it's the background to some of the things he's going to say about the journey of the soul. You can see his chariot allegory, references in the Meno, the Timaeus, and the Laws. These are dialogues where he seems to bring up various mythological stories that underscore the concept of the journey of the soul. The bottom line is that once the soul is separated from the body, the soul goes to the world of forms, where ultimately the gods will send it back into this world, assuming another body. And the question, of course, which underscores part of the noble lie, is why is it that some people are better learners, more scholarly, brighter, more intelligent, if you will, or have various kinds of gifts? According to Plato, the soul at birth loses its clear recollection of the forms. It leaves the world of forms, it comes with acquaintance and knowledge of all the forms, and through the process of being born into this world, it loses that clear knowledge of the forms. When Socrates says, "I do not know anything," effectively he could be saying, "I know I've forgotten everything." Well, that brings us to this end of this summary of Plato's Epistemology. Again, I hope you've been working your way through the worksheet. I'm going to invite you now to take a pause, and we'll move across to the third video in this series on Plato, where we'll look at his value theory. So let's take a break at this point and let you catch up on your notes, and we'll see you on the other side in the next video.